The we're going to learn this morning was delivered by the Rebbe on early Gimel Tishrei, which is the eve of the 13th of Tishrei, which is the Hilula, the day of the yahrzeit of the Rebbe Maharash, the fourth Rebbe. The Maamar was originally delivered in Tafshin Mem Aleph, 1980, was edited in 1987, and then released. Sukkot Shelter Shivas Yomim. The Torah says in Parshas Emor, this is in the middle of the book of Leviticus, that we should dwell in the sukkah for 7 days. Literally, teshvu means to sit, but it doesn't mean sit, it means to spend time, to settle into the sukkah. And why might we do this? Why might we settle into an outdoor, temporary structure that lets the inclement weather in? The rain can get in, the cold can get in. What's the point? So the Torah says the reason we should do this is L'man yedu derisechem, so that future generations will know, which means future generations will contemplate. And as such, they will know. Ki basukkot shafti es bnei Yisrael. God says that I settled you in temporary dwellings. B'haitzi yisam me'eretz Mitzrayim, when I took the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. That's what the pasuk says. So there's much said about this pasuk in Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the Gemara records a dispute as to what exactly we mean. L'man yedu derisechem. Which detail of the Exodus do we recall by sitting in a sukkah? And why don't we eat matzah in a sukkah? And why isn't the seder held in a sukkah?
No.
That would be nice to
There are many questions that are asked and answered. But the point we're going to focus on today is the notion that the sukkah represents not the actual dwellings that the Jewish people lived in, because they had to have lived in temporary dwellings. After all, their existence was transient. But rather, that the sukkah recalls the nature of Hashem's special protection. As the Rebbe says, Pasuk zeh maybe Rabbeinu Hazaken b'Shulchan Aruch Reish Hilchos Sukkah. The Alter Rebbe chose to bring this pasuk, heralding the laws of sukkah. Umedayek b'Lashon Hazav, and in the Alter Rebbe's proverbial golden language, the Alter Rebbe selected every single word and every nuance very, very carefully, like finest of gold. The Basukkah is Shavti. The emphasis is I settled you in the sukkah, not you sat in a sukkah, not you dwelled in a temporary way. That wouldn't be God having settled you. That would be, was nothing else to do, so we found some temporary shelter. That wouldn't be Basukkah Shavti. That wouldn't be God saying, I settled you. I sat you in a sukkah. If it's God who sat us in a sukkah, then it has to be something that God did. What did God do? When we left Egypt, what did God do for our being settled or finding shelter? And the answer would follow the opinion which is articulated in the Talmud, that Heim Hoyu Anane Kavod. These were the proverbial clouds of glory, which were not just about glory and honor, but actually provided shelter for the Jewish people when we left the land of Egypt. Shehikifam Bahem Litzel. Hashem surrounded the nation in this cloud-like reality, and these clouds shielded them from the heat, the withering heat of the sun. So that's the Basukkos Hashavti. God settled you in the sukkah. Not you settled yourself. Not somehow you managed to survive in the howling empty wilderness by creating temporary huts and dwellings. And we try to recreate that today by going outside of our comfortable and permanent homes to live in a transient and a temporary kind of dwelling, which would recall the fact that once upon a time, we didn't have the privilege of permanent homes, and we didn't know how we'd be shielded or protected. No. Basukkah says Shavti. God settled us in the sukkah. So the Alter Rebbe says, God settled us in the sukkah has to refer to the concept of the Anani HaKavod, as it says in the Gemara. The Dugmalazeh. So therefore, as a paradigm, not as this is the sukkah, as a paradigm, to make us think and to make us recall and to give us a talking point, if you will, even though the mitzvah is not to talk on Sukkot evening. The mitzvah is to be on Sukkot evening. On Pesach, the mitzvah is to talk about it. And we talk about it with all kinds of visual aids. And we demonstrate it. We taste it, we sing it, we narrate it, We look at it, we feel it, we touch it, we have all different, we demonstrate it. We have all different ways of demonstrating the message of freedom and the idea of us having left the land of Mitzrayim. On Sukkot, we do not talk about it. There isn't a mitzvah to talk about it. It's a mitzvah to be. Obviously, when people are, they talk. It's inevitable. But the mitzvah isn't the conversation. The mitzvah is to be in the situation. And invariably, when we're in that situation, we start asking questions to ourselves, start thinking, what are we doing here? And the conclusion of whatever thoughts we might have or conversations that will ensue will lead us in a direction. So this is a dogma, this is a paradigm of us being in a very tenuous situation, not having the privilege of shield and protection, and yet we were safe, and yet we survived. So this is the idea of the notion of us creating a sukkah. Hasuya l'tzel. What's the primary function of the sukkah? The answer is shade. That's the function of the sukkah. The sukkah does not provide climate control. It doesn't. If it's cold outside, it'll be cold in the sukkah. If it's hot outside, it'll be hot in the sukkah. It will not be comfortable in the sukkah unless it happens to be comfortable outside. What does the sukkah provide though? What's the difference between the great outdoors and the indoors of the sukkah? Temperature is the same as outdoors. What's the difference? The emphasis is shade. That's the difference. It provides, you can get shade. The Rebbe Marash, the Bala Hilul of Yud Gimel Tishrei, explains, incidentally, this Shabbos is Yud Gimel Tishrei. So he explains in the Memorim of Chag HaSukkos, Shenem Rulfnei Meir Shana, the Rebbe is delivering this Maimer in 1980, and he's recalling a Maimer that was delivered exactly 100 years earlier in 1880 by the Rebbe Marash. And he says, the Schach HaSukkah, that the covering of the sukkah, which is the real emphasis of the sukkah, the sheltering walls of the sukkah don't really have a specific code of halacha of how they have to be. The walls can be virtually anything. There's no halachas of what's a kosher wall. As long as it's a wall, it's a wall. A barrier is a barrier. That's good enough. But when it comes to the schach, we have many halachas of what does work and what doesn't work, how it has to be placed. So the schach of the sukkah, which is the shade of the sukkah, this is nasa mi'anan haktoiris the Yom Kippurim. The Rebbe Marash says that is manufactured from, is synthesized from the plume of smoke, the clouds of smoke that are generated on Yom Kippur. And he says, anan hu k'moitzel, to cloud over or to shade is really not so different. It's kind of one and the same. Very, very similar concepts. Now this idea is talked about copiously throughout the writings of Chassidus. It's not a new idea per se of the Rebbe Marash, although the Rebbe Marash really developed this idea in the fullest sense. Ela shebiyom Kippurim, on the day of Yom Kippur, hu behelam adayin. All of this is still in a latent potential state, what's called bakese, because there's a pasuk that's used to describe the high holiday season, the period of Tishrei. It says bakese, and then it says liyom chagenu. It says what's hidden, tiku b'chodesh shofar. You blow the shofar, you sound the shofar when we come to the month. Bakese, what's hidden, and then it says liyom chagenu, for the day of our celebration, day of our holiday. Now, of course, you could read that entirely as one long sentence, or you could break up the sentence and you could see different verses, different parts of the verse, different parts of the pasuk, speaking or alluding to different parts of the high holidays. The season of awe, bakese, what's hidden, what's concealed, first and foremost, because on Rosh Hashanah, the moon is concealed, and on Sukkot, the moon is fully revealed. We get a full moon. So bakese means when the moon is concealed. But bakese also refers to Yom Kippurim. It's the days of awe. And then there's Yom Chagenu, and then there's days of our rejoicing, and that's the idea of revelation, when things are out in the open. So first things are in a latent potential state, and then they move into the actual state. So bakese refers to Yom Kippurim. Uba begilui, it comes in a revealed state, l'yom chagenu, to the day of our festival. Which this is, of course, a verbiage from the scripture, from the Tillim, of Psalm 81. And that happens, as it explains, the Chag HaSukkot, on the day of the Sukkah. Now, in Tillim, the word bakese, by the way, is spelled with a hey. And then when you take a look at it and you see how the Alter Rebbe talks about this in Sukkot Shelter, he spells bakese with an aleph, which is like a different kind of word. But this idea is brought down in the Shiltis and other places. It's not. There is such a concept in transposition of certain letters and the idea of different meanings contained in a single word. At any rate, the point is, on Yom Kippur things are in a latent state, and on Sukkot they come to be in a revealed state. And here's not the place where we emphasize that. He is merely mentioning this notion. So whatever is there in a revealed state on Sukkot would already have been in a latent state on Yom Kippur, or even sometimes on Rosh Hashanah. So it's a process, an evolutionary process through which things move from the potential into the actual. V'hine, v'sukkah tzarich lies tzilosa meruba mechamasa. When it comes to the sukkah, so we have a clear statement which is made in the Mishnah, and that's the halacha, that the single most important ingredient for making a sukkah kosher is that the shade has to outweigh the sunlight, meaning there has to be a greater volume of shade. If you have 51% shade and 49% sunlight, then you have a kosher sukkah. Of course, that would be very hard to quantify, and we would say you should probably have 60 or 70% shade so that you can actually see it and you actually know with certainty that you have more shade. But theoretically speaking, as long as there's a majority of shade, as long as there's more shade than sunlight, you have a kosher sukkah. So tzilasa meruba mechamasa is a major concept within sukkah. It's a major foundational principle. In other words, hanishibas sukkah yesh gam chamasa. That means in the sukkah there's also sunlight. Tzilasa meruba mechamasa. It doesn't say rak tzel. It doesn't say in the sukkah should be only sunlight. It says in only shade. It says in the sukkah should be shade that outpaces, that is greater in volume than the sunlight. So the sukkah requires sunlight and shade. Make sure you have more shade. So what would that mean? What is the idea of shade and what is the idea of sunlight? It's only that the sunlight and shade both have to be represented in the sukkah. There has to be more shade than sunlight. It's got the sunlight too. Similarly, on Yom Kippur, we have the same idea. There's an inyan of sun too. A sun and this cloud, or fire and smoke. What does this mean? The primary focus on Yom Kippur, is the idea of the shade that is cast by the smoke. Things are shaded over by smoke. The hine, beis and yanim, both of these ideas, chamasa and silasa, sunlight and shade, are the Avedas Beis HaMikdash. Both of them are represented by the things done in the Holy Temple in the Beis HaMikdash. How are they both represented in the Beis HaMikdash? Very simple. And by the way, not only is this in the Beis HaMikdash, but it's also it's also betfilos shebemekayim korbanos tiknum. It's also found in represented within the notion of tefillah, of prayer, which is said to be in lieu of the offerings in the Beis HaMikdash. What are they? Heim avodas hakorbanos. They are respectively the avodah, the service of the offerings, the animal and meal offerings, and the avodas haktoros, the service of the incense. The korbanos, when it comes to the offerings, what does the Torah say? It says, korbani lachmi leishai. It says, my offering, my bread, my fire. Leishai, my fire offering. The emphasis is on the fire offering. Ishai. The Eish, when it comes to the idea of the fire is part of the offering. Because Eish sheba min hahedyet. The fire has to come from the lower, the ordinary, the mundane. We bring the fire. There's also fire that comes from a higher place. So we bring fire from below. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends fire from on high. The hedyet, the commoner, he brings an offering of fire. We bring fire. Hashem adds fire. It's part of the korban, a major part of the korban. Hu inyan hachayim. So fire is heat. That's chamasa. That's like sunlight. The ball of fire called the sun generates heat. That's like the fire element of the korban, which is fire from below and fire from on high. The incinerating fire of the korban. Then there's Avodas HaKetoros. Then there's the service of the Ketoret. And the Ketoret, the incense, is Ikrahu Ha'anan. The main thing isn't the fire, because you didn't even see fire. It was coals. The coals were burning. They were red hot coals, but there wasn't actually fire. You took these red hot coals and you covered them with incense, ground incense. And what was developed as a result was a cloud of smoke that shot up from it. So the Rebbe says that's, tzilasa. That's the concept of shade. Because when there's clouds, you can't get sunlight. The clouds stop the sun. And the clouds could be condensation, which is the clouds in heaven, or the clouds could be simply smoke. When it's very smoky, then you can't have the sunlight. It's called smog in Los Angeles. A lot of sun, a lot of smoke going up, the sunlight isn't filtering through clearly. This is the meaning that in Yom Kippur there's the idea of fire. Fire represents Avodas HaKorbanos. There's the Avodah, the service of offerings, and that's part of the service of Yom Kippur. But that's not the primary focus of Yom Kippur. The primary focus of Yom Kippur, that's Avodas HaKetoros. That's the Avodah of the incense. Yeah. Because the things that were done especially for Yom Kippur, like going into the Holy of Holies, were specifically with incense, as it says, Ki ba'anan eroa el hakaperes. You want to show up in the Holy of Holies, that's great. Bezois yavei aron. There's offerings, Ki ba'anan. Come with the smoke. Come with the incense. So the incense represents the cloud, the shade, and the fire represents the offerings that are brought. Okay.
How's that different for the sukkah?
Huh?
How's that different for the sukkah?
How is that different for the sukkah? That it's the same idea of the
So
sukkah.
more shade covering the sun.
More shade than fire. On Yom Kippur is more incense than offerings. It's the same idea.
Yeah.
Greater emphasis on the shade, more so than the fire. Be it a hefresh ben korbanos l'ktedes. Oh, sorry, I skipped.
Last line.
Thank you. From this, this is where Sukkot comes from. Sukkot is essentially the evolutionary development, where the latent potential of Yom Kippurim develops into the Sukkah. In other words, the Yom Kippur offerings become the Sukkah. How? The fire and the smoke of Yom Kippurim, which is a greater emphasis on the smoke, the cloud, that metamorphoses into the sukkah, which has to have chamasa meruba mitzilasa, which has to have a greater emphasis on shade, more so than fire, which is the idea of liyom chagenu, the idea of the day of our festival, when it moves into an actual state. Shetzarach li is tzilasa meruba mechamasa. It's the same principles. It's the same exact idea as replicated, only on Sukkot, it becomes in a revealed state. We're actually sitting in the sukkah, where the shade outpaces the concept of the fire, just like in Yom Kippurim, there was greater emphasis on the incense, on the smoke, more so than the fire of the offerings. So this is really up until now primarily a recapitulation of the teaching of the Rabbi Marash, which is developed from the teachings of the previous Rabbeim and Torah Shabbat that comes before. The Rebbe sets out now to explain the difference between korbanos and ketoros. Like a primary point of the thesis we just mentioned is that there's a difference between offerings and incense. What's the difference? The Rebbe says Yuvan Mishmam can be understood from their names. Asher Yikru Lahem B'Lashon HaKodesh, the names they're called in the Holy Tongue in Hebrew, which is like the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, famous Torah, which is brought down as Shaykh of the Emunah, that the name of something in Hebrew actually is a representation of its spiritual reality. Much like H2O is water. Why? It describes what water is. Water doesn't describe anything. That's just a word. But H2O does. Mayim describes what it is. It actually is the energy of Mem coming first, followed, then modified by a Yud and a Mem. That's what the spiritual reality of water is. What is water? It's Mayim. If you knew what Mem, Yud and Mem is, you'd know what water is, or what develops water, from where it comes from. So the name in Hebrew isn't an arbitrary title, just a label for something that people agreed to call something by a certain name, and since they all agreed to call it a certain way, so they know what they're talking about. If everybody calls this a table, so then everybody knows, let's sit down by the table, we know exactly where we want to sit. Why? Because that's what we call a table. But in Hebrew, if it's a shulchan, it's not just we decided to call it. It is a shulchan. It is a shin lamed ches nun. That's what it is. So the difference between korbanot and ketoret will be understood by looking at the Hebrew verbiage, the name itself. So korban is milashon kiruv. The word korban comes from the terminology of kiruv, which means closeness. Now the terminology closeness as being identified as synonymous with korban goes back all the way to Reb Nechunya ben Arkana in what's called the Sefer HaBahir. Sefer HaBahir is the second book of Kabbalah ever written. When the Zohar was hidden away for centuries, the Bahir was the oldest and most considered the most foundational text we had. In the Sefer HaBahir, it talks about the idea of the korban being connected to kiruv. The Rebbe here invokes the teachings of the previous Rebbe in the famous Hemshech of Basiligani. Shekarban is who we need kiruv. That what does a korban mean? A korban means bringing close. Bringing close, keiches and chushim. Bringing close the powers and wherewithals, the talents and abilities that God gave us. In other words, if God gave us a certain ability, our mission in life is to take that and harness it for a holy and a sacred purpose. Bring it close to Hashem. Because in a natural state, it's not necessarily close to Hashem. It doesn't reflect God's presence. It has to be utilized as such, has to be developed as such. And that terminology is kiruv. It means to bring it close. And Raza the Korbanot, Oilad Raza the Inseif, the mystery of the Korban is so powerful and profound that it stirs the mystery, the enigma of the infinitude of divinity, the essence of God. So that's what Korbanos is. Korbanos means closeness. Let's get closer. Let's get closer to God. How do we get closer to God? We give a gift. We go through the motions of taking something, giving it away for Hashem, and in doing so, we're taking the material things, bringing them closer to God. We become closer to God. But ketores is l'shen kesher. The word ketores actually comes from the terminology of being knotted, sewn together. Ki kol kesher shebe pasuk. Every time we have the terminology of a knot in the pasuk, it's meturgim b'l'shen in Aramaic. Then it is translated as keter with a tes. Keter with a kuf and a tes. In keter with a kuf and a tes, not a chaf and a tuf. A chaf and a tuf spells a crown, but with a kuf and a tes, keter spells the concept of knotted. So this proves to us, as the Tzemach Tzedek says in the Torah, that ketores is then linked to the concept of being knotted. In other words, we're not only getting close to God, but furthermore, the kiruv, not even tachlis hakiruv, the closest, very intimate closeness, you're also bound, knotted, tied to God, until we reach a level of being mekusher betachlis, knotted together as one, braided as one. V'hefresh bein kiruv, the difference between closeness, which is korbanot, offerings, and hiskashrus, being bound, the idea of ketores, being knotted, hu dekasher hu mekurev le'elikus, when you're close to godliness or divinity, gam kishu mekurev betachlis hakiruv, even when you're as intimate and close as humanly possible, hu bechinas metzias adayin. I feel close. I'm really close. I'm so close, I'm almost overwhelmed, but I'm still close. Still I. V'zesher b'korbanos ksiv lachmi le'ishai, my bread, my fire. In other words, that the avodas hakorbanos, the service of the korbanot, comes as a result of chamasa, of fire. Ki avodah de korbanos b'derech klal is avodah shal pi tam v'das. The avodah, the service of korbanos, comes in a way which is linked to rhyme and reason. There's some kind of understanding. There's my persona involved or mixed in it. This is my fire. This is I'm bringing a fire close to God. I'm bringing the bread offering to God. I'm not totally displaced. I'm a partner here in this relationship. And even that which is triggered or catalyzed as a result of this commitment to God, this communion that's engendered through my closeness, through my devotion, that we say, that God says, I derive pleasure from the fact that I made a command. I asked for something, and you did what I asked for. It's also shaykh l'tam v'das. It's also connected to rhyme and reason. When you have love, that love comes from rhyme and reason, reasonable love, so then it's also felt as such. Feel that love. I love this. Why do you love that? I can explain to you why I love it. Because of A and B and C and D. We could have predicted these people would love each other. Yeah, it's predictable. It's not illogical. It's not impossible to fathom. It makes sense. Each one brings something else to the table. Each one completes something that the other one didn't have before. Okay, it's understandable how there's two sides of a circle. It's understandable how it comes together. So therefore, this is what's called in Chassidus, the terminology of murgush. There's a sense of feeling of self-value. That's why there's heat. As it says, V'tukva shilhuva derachamisa. This is a very interesting statement, which is made in the Zohar, and means something to the effect of the power of something generates heat. The force generates heat, invariably. So the force of the fire that's the force of the love. The Aveda of Nara together with their Chlal, this represents feelings which are loftier than rhyme and reason. The love isn't felt in an overt way. There's a oneness that's felt. The oneness is not even felt. It's so at one that there isn't any overt feelings involved here. This is the idea of ketores, that's Lashon Kesher, that it comes to the terminology of Nared. This is when a person becomes so connected, so at one with God, that he doesn't even feel the oneness. He doesn't feel. There isn't an I. I love. I am. I appreciate. I enjoy. I feel close. The I isn't there anymore. All there is the subject of one's love. And that I feel bound and connected to this. Until it becomes basically an extension of it. In the famous expression, which came from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, about describing the last day of his life, that I became knotted as one with God, as one. In other words, that he reached a point where it wasn't simply knotted, but he melted into God, divinity. There wasn't any more a separate reality. In other words, the Be'achida, the oneness is Shenasa Chad Ma B'Shemein Seif Baruch Hu. I'll give you a really silly example, super silly example to explain this. So everybody knows the Fiddler on the Roof, that famous spiritual teaching, right? Do you love me? Do I love you? I don't know. People didn't talk about love once upon a time. For 25 years, I did your laundry, I did this, that. Do I love you? These are people didn't talk about romance and love the way people talk about today. Because some of these couples that are married for 60 years, one dies and the other one dies a week later. They can't even imagine life apart from each other. It becomes so at one. It's not a thing of, I love you, I don't love you. There's romance, we're fighting, we have closeness, we have distance. But there's very much there's very much of the I. And then there's this idea of transcending that the I, it melts into one. They can't imagine, it's impossible to imagine life any other way. Because that becomes literally an actual extension of you. So a person could be involved, he's in a romantic relationship with God. He feels this closeness to God. He's excited about godliness. He prays with great fervor. He feels good about this relationship. And he's excited about it. And then somebody wants to take it away and he fights for it. And then there's the possibility of a person who's so close to Hashem, he doesn't know life otherwise. Can't fathom life other than life with Hashem. It's not a question of the struggle of doing what's right, not doing what's right. To him, it's not even a question of doing what Hashem wants. If it can't do what Hashem wants, I don't want to live. There's no other reason to live. That is the singular definition of life itself. That represents the idea of Korbanot, of Ketoret. So Korbanot is, I'm bringing a Korban. Ketoret is, I become swept up in that oneness. And basically what we're hearing is that the Sukkah is sitting within the embrace of God. The Sukkah is when I'm not doing something holy per se. Everything I'm doing is holy. Because as long as I'm not doing anything bad, the regular, ordinary, mundane things I'm doing in the Sukkah, they're all holy. They're all in God's embrace, which is the level of Sukkah, and this is just top of the iceberg. This is just grazing the surface of this Maimer that goes on to explain the difference between Ketoret and Korbanot and the profundity of the Sukkah and the sublime spiritual achievement of the Sukkah that comes from the concept of Yom Kippur. Hashem should help us. We should be able to experience that oneness in the highest way with the coming of Mashiach and being in the Sukkah of David. Thank you all for joining us. Shabbat Shalom.